Well, you are the burglar. Go down and burgle something.
Very well.
J.R.R. Tolkien is the unquestioned godfather of fantasy literature. You might find him daunting or even tedious, but the books he penned in the 30s and 50s defined fantasy. He was much more serious and intricate than the adventurous H. Rider Haggard, the ominous H.P. Lovecraft, the gentle C.S. Lewis, or the brawny Edgar Rice Burroughs, to name just a few others who spawned their own niches in fantasy around that era. With the massive global success of Peter Jackson's early 2000s trilogy of films, Tolkien's place was cemented, even for those who were never going to crack open his books. But Middle-earth's films didn't start and end with Jackson, and previous generations have had their own gateways into Tolkien's mythical world. A good decade after the books were published in Britain, they were unleashed in North America. Frodo Lives sprang up as graffiti on subway walls, referring to when the Hobbit Sam Gamgee realized his friend and employer Frodo Baggins had survived attacks from goblins and a giant spider. In 1979, weirdo cartoonist Ralph Bakshi, the guy responsible for Wizards, Cool World, Fire and Ice, and Fritz the Cat, bought the rights for the first two books and made a terrifying, dead-serious adaptation of the first half of the story. The film did okay financially, but many Tolkien fans and critics found it infuriating. The second half never materialized, despite the very brave and adult choices that Bakshi made, and some stunning character design for the Nazgul, Gollum, and Aragorn. But a year before, Rankin Bass Studios had put out the film that introduced me to Tolkien, The Hobbit. Yeah, Rankin Bass, who made a series of highly successful Christmas specials through the 60s and 70s, and did some very weird things in the 80s. The Rankin Bass version of The Hobbit stuck impressively close to its source material, and reached artistic peaks that the studio never really matched before or afterwards. This may be in part because of their partnership with the Japanese animation studio Topcraft, which would later dissolve and reform as Studio Gibli. Not a bad talent pool. Their collaborations would include the brilliantly creepy Last Unicorn and the intriguingly scientific Flight of Dragons. A quick recap of the plot. A quiet, small gentleman named Bilbo Baggins is unexpectedly selected by the wizard Gandalf and a group of dwarves to be their burglar as they attempt to steal the gold hidden in their ancestral home, the Lonely Mountain, from a dragon named Smaug, who has chased the dwarves away. It's not all just about the gold, though. The dwarves clearly are despairing because their territory, including the Misty Mountain and also the mines of Moria, have been overrun by malevolent monsters. Bilbo breaks from his middle-class comforts and joins the expedition. From there, it's a story of Bilbo discovering his untested resolve and talents he didn't know he had as they journey to the dragon's lair.
There are moments which can change a person for all time. And I suddenly wondered if I would ever see my snug hobbit hole again. I wondered if I actually wanted to.
He survives hungry trolls, goblin captivity, giant spiders, and paranoid elves. By the time he reaches the Lonely Mountain, Bilbo has become a completely different person. He faces down Smaug on his own, and helps a local archer kill the dragon. This doesn't stop various factions, elves, dwarves, goblins, humans, and eagles, from battling over who gets to keep the gold. The Battle of the Five Armies ensues.
Onward! Forward! To battle!
In the end, most of the dwarves Bilbo had traveled with are killed. He returns home wiser, a little richer, and definitely sadder.
You did understand war. It was I who did not. Until now.
The secret of Bilbo's success, though, is a magic ring which he steals from a bizarre cave dweller in the abandoned dwarf mines, now home to the Kingdom of Goblins. Wearing the ring turns Bilbo invisible, and for unexplained reasons he hides that from his dwarf companions, although Gandalf sniffs it out immediately and knows what's up.
Your story, Bilbo, has the ring of truth. Yes, it rings true.
Those who continue on to read Lord of the Rings will know that his trick invisibility ring is actually a malevolent talisman that awakens the godlike sorcerer king, Sauron. It's the one ring to rule them all.
Is it secret? Is it safe?
The Hobbit doesn't go into these darker depths, and it works as a children's book. It won awards for juvenile literature when it came out, and I'll admit that I listened to my father read it when I was about 5, and was entranced throughout. Unlike the nouveau realist stylings of Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, the 1977 Hobbit looks like a fairy tale. The firm, clear outlines of the character design certainly set this style apart from Disney or the other successful cartoon studios of the day, giving the animation a fairy tale look as if made on painted wood. The source novel, like Lord of the Rings, was full of songs, and the soundtrack does great justice to these.
Blunt the knives and bend the forks, smash the bottles, burn the corks.
They fit comfortably into the narrative, despite the 1970s feel, especially Glenn Yarbrough's The Road Goes Ever, Ever On.
Over grass and over stone, under the mountains in the moon.
Bakshi scoffed at these songs as an excuse to sell LPs. I think they fit nicely into the film, and give the feel of a bard telling a tale around the hearth. The film boasts wonderful voice actors. The great director John Huston, who plays Gandalf, makes the biggest impression, carrying an otherworldly weight of wisdom. TV personality Orson Bean makes a fine Bilbo Baggins, sounding thoughtful and wide-eyed, if a little strained in the action scenes.
Now I will give you a name, and I shall call you Sting.
Hans Conried, the voice of Captain Hook and Snidely Whiplash, plays the dwarves' leader Thorin Oakenshield. Director Otto Preminger shows up, as does Rankin Bass and Disney stalwart Paul Frees. The singing goblins are voiced by Tony the Tiger, and everything at Disneyland that isn't Paul Frees, Thurl Ravenscroft. The Hobbit is all about the call of the wild. Bilbo shakes off his comfortable, complacent lifestyle to launch into the world with a group of strangers. Granted, he does this with the endorsement of Gandalf, who he trusts steadfastly, if inexplicably. After all, Gandalf has a habit of disappearing when he might be needed and then showing up at the last second to save everybody's bacon. As Bilbo plunges further and further east, the direction of new life in British mythology, since that's where the sun rises, after all.
Oh, I do love maps.
He grows braver, trickier, and more philosophical. It's as if leaving your comfortable bubble and being threatened by new experiences and ideas can make you a better person. Crazy talk. There's also an underlying message that the tongue is mightier than the sword. The dwarves, likable as they are, face every challenge with swords and axes. Bilbo, on the other hand, defeats Gollum, the Wood Elves, and Smaug with his wits. Gandalf deals with most issues by building bridges. Hobbits with dwarves, dwarves with eagles, men with elves and dwarves and eagles. The dwarves do obtain their goal of reclaiming their homeland eventually thanks to physical violence, but it's at a high cost. Bilbo, who fights mostly with his wits, heads home with money and unforgettable life experiences, relatively unscathed. I mentioned earlier that Ralph Bakshi owned the rights to the first 2 books in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and put his film out just a year after the Rankin Bass Hobbit. He failed to stop Rankin Bass from making their version of Lord of the Rings, and the Rankin Bass studio seized the chance to make the sequel they dreamed of, an animated version of Return of the King. The only problem was, Bakshi still had the rights to everything from the first 2 books, so there's a half book-size gap between Bakshi's epic and Rankin Bass's TV special of Return of the King. Rankin Bass was not allowed to mention anything from the first 2 books because of rights issues, and that leads to some awkward moments when, say, Galadriel can't be mentioned, but her magical gifts to Sam Gamgee are crucial in the opening of the film.
The Phial of Gladriel, I can say no more.
This lack of cohesion kneecaps Return of the King, sadly. There are many fine moments. Eowyn and Pippin killing the Witch King of Angmar is particularly effective, as is the death of Denethor, better than the Peter Jackson version, and the confrontation with the Mouth of Sauron. On the other hand...
Frodo of the 9 fingers and the Ring of Doom.
That 1970s soundtrack vibe worked for The Hobbit, but it's fingernails on a blackboard here. Where there's a whip, there's a way is catchy and hilarious in its cynical honesty.
Where there's a whip, there's a way.
But excising the music entirely would improve this film quite a bit. I'd pay to see The Hobbit on the big screen, despite clear commercial breaks, but the Rankin Bass Return of the King really needs to stay on television, which is where it belongs. Adaptations of novels are tough. Sergei Bondarchuk's 7-hour, 20-minute version of War and Peace from 1967 barely squeezes in all of Tolstoy's epic book, and leaves out many key sequences, at 7 hours and 20 minutes. Tom Bombadil fans are naturally frustrated that his earthy paganism was cut out of Peter Jackson's giant trilogy. Expectations run high. And when you're fitting a novel into a TV special, it's going to be tough unless you make it a miniseries. The Hobbit does an admirable job of telling a clear, well-paced story that clocks in right where it should. Sure, some things are cut that I'd love to have seen on screen, but Peter Jackson gave us those things, and much, much, much more than we wanted, by bloating this little book into a near 9-hour slog. I don't know what those movies were about, except for money. Watching the cartoon TV special, I know exactly what the take-home message is, and I think it's the one that J.R.R. Tolkien had in mind. Get out there, explore the world, get uncomfortable.
Extinguish me!
Help strangers.
Oh, always glad to help a friend.
I can't tell you how grateful I am.
Use your head. Avoid conflict if necessary, but step up to the plate if your loved ones are threatened. This isn't rocket science. It's bedrock wisdom for being a human. Or a hobbit.